Hello, writers, and welcome back to Spooky Writes, your channel all about writing. I'm your host, who's secretly a ghost, Kamal Onor. Today we are diving into the topic of change. Not this change, but this type of change. We are getting into how to get a character to change and evolve over the course of a story. Something that I notice a lot of horror novels and horror stories do is that they tend to leave characters underdeveloped. Perhaps the thinking is, well, the character is just going to die, so why would anyone care about Steve? Well, I care about Steve, and I want to make sure that Steve is well written. Well, I care about Steve, and I want to make sure that Steve is well written whether he lives or dies. Sorry, Steve. Remember that stories are about characters. Readers want to see characters reacting to a situation in your story. And so, like I mentioned in my video on Does Fiction Need to Be Believable, I talked a lot about how the situation can be unbelievable, but regardless, your characters need to be believable. And I talked a little bit about how evolution and change within your characters needs to be believable. So believability doesn't just apply to the way that the character reacts, it also applies to how the character behaves over the course of the novel or the story, how this character evolves and how this character is affected by the actions that he or she takes during the course of the story, during the course of the novel. What makes the character interesting is not whether he or she lives at the end of the story or whether he or she fails or succeeds in the novel. What matters is how this character is affected by the events that have transpired over the course of this novel or over the course of a short story. In essence, what makes a character interesting is who that person becomes at the end of the story. Most novels have a character going through a journey or a traumatic event. And would any of this matter if the character just shrugged his or her shoulders and went, well, back to my old life? Just imagine how unsatisfying The Hobbit would be if after Bilbo's grand adventure, he returns home and he just goes back to the way that he was before Gandalf ever showed up. It would mean that the whole story had zero effect on the character, and there was no need for us to witness any of it because there was no grand change in the character. The character is the same and it's unsatisfying because stories need to evoke change. Stories need to highlight change. They need to show change of a character transitioning from who they were at the beginning of the story to who they are by the final page. After all, if the story has no effect on your character, it's going to have no effect on your reader. Stories need to affect. They need to show your character changing. They need to affect your characters in a visceral way that forces them to become different people, for them to evolve in a way that the reader was not expecting at the beginning. Many stories will show characters living a boring life at the beginning, and by the end they've gone through this massive journey. They've gone through this massive transition. They've overcome obstacles. They've had a journey. They're no longer the same person that they were at the start of the novel, and this is what readers want. This is what we want to see in our writing. Writing is about highlighting the changes in your characters over the course of a novel. It's not about a character falling in love with a monster. It's not about whether a character lives or dies. Stories need to show what effect the events that your character has gone through. What effect has your character overcoming these obstacles? What effect has your story had on your character getting out of his or her comfort zone and going on a journey and becoming someone that they never thought they could ever become? So to create a believable evolution for your protagonist, for your characters, you need to put him or her into a situation that forces change. You can think about things such as, what is your character deathly afraid of? Is your character afraid of being alone? Is your character afraid of never finding love? Is your character afraid of the dark? And then put that character into a situation that forces him or her to confront his or her fear. Because you want to have a story that forces a character to face and ideally overcome. You want to write a story that has a character who has to face or overcome his or her obstacle that is preventing them from changing, that is preventing them from becoming the best version of themselves. And so think about a story as after all these events, after all this hardship has occurred to your characters, who are they now that they've gone through these trials and tribulations? You might have a character who spent his entire life in a peaceful farm-like community, the Shire, and he goes on a grand adventure, faces a dragon, and he's no longer the same hobbit that he once was. He is completely changed when he returns home. It's not just the fact that he's returned home with gold, it's not just the fact that he's returned home with vast mountains of wealth, but it's the fact that he is a completely different character than who he was at the start of the story. In a sense, your character has to go through an evolution because, again, your story has to have some effect on your characters. Otherwise, it's going to have no effect on your readers, because there's no reason for a reader to read a story when it all means nothing at the end. If it means nothing, if the character goes through all this, if the character goes through this massive journey and overcomes these trials and tribulations, if a character travels across the world and faces off a big demon monster and saves the kingdom, and they just go right back to their normal day life, if there's no effect on that character, what reason was there to have that character go on that journey? What reason was there to write this story in the first place if it's not to highlight the change that the character has gone through, and what effect all these events that the character has overcome or perhaps failed to overcome, and who are they now? Who are they now that they've gone through all this? Who are they now that they face these obstacles? Who have they become? And so, in terms of believability, characters should not change on a whim just to serve the story. The story that you're writing has the characters going into a big spooky cave, but your character is 7 years old and is terrified of the dark. They can't suddenly be like, "Yay, darkness, run into the cave." You have to show your characters being resistant to what they're afraid of. You have to show characters not wanting to change, because people don't want to change, and characters need to reflect this in the writing. You need to write characters who are resistant to change and resistant to becoming someone new. And willingly or unwillingly, your character needs to go through some transformation. They need to evolve and become a higher version of themselves. They need to become a stronger version of themselves. They need to rise up and become the new king of the land. They need to rise up and discover the true power that they have inside of them. So when you have characters that suddenly have change of heart that come across as inauthentic, it's a sign of poor writing. It's a sign of having a bland character. If the character has nothing that they are afraid of, if the character has nothing that defines them as unique, if the character has nothing that defines him or her as who they are at the core. Again, if we use the example of Bilbo Baggins, we have a hobbit, and a hobbit is very well described in Tolkien's work, and we see that he is, at the beginning of the story, he's very much stuck in his ways. He doesn't want to go on an adventure. He says adventures are nasty things that make one late for dinner. And we see that over the course of Bilbo's grand adventure, over his journey, he becomes a completely different character. So in order to make your characters more interesting, to make your character's evolution believable, you have to put your characters into uncomfortable situations. You have to force characters to face their fears. You have to put characters on a muddy road with no handkerchief. You have to put characters in the woods without a walking stick. You have to put characters in situations that they don't enjoy, that they might be resistant to. And then you have to show what their reaction is to these hardships that they are facing. Is your character able to slowly accept that they are in a hard situation? Are they able to slowly change and slowly evolve over the course of your pages, over the course of your writing? Again, we want characters who change over the course of a novel. We don't want static characters who stay the same throughout. If the story has no effect on the characters, there's really no reason to talk about it. If your character was a boring accountant at the start of the story, and they go into an extra dimension, or they travel to Mars and they go on this grand adventure and they come right back and they're the same exact person, what was the reason for this story? What was the reason to write this thing in the first place? It's kind of like having a character go through a dream sequence and ending the story with, "It was all a dream." It means that none of it mattered and it didn't have any effect on the character. So what purpose was there to read this story? Give your characters a reason to face their fears and come out on the other side different. And as always, keep it spooky. And of course, here's your writing prompt for sticking all the way through the video. All his life he was afraid of heights, but now he was blank. So set your timer and start writing. Thank you so much.